Welcome to my field of dreams. It reaches far and wide. To you it might seem nothing much, but I stand here with pride. If you build it, they will come.
Hi, I'm Nemo James, singer, songwriter, and author, and I'd like to welcome you once again to my podcast, Nemo James Travel Diaries. This podcast is ad-free, but I hope you will forgive me for including short excerpts of some of my songs. If you would like to hear more of the songs I include, you will find a link to them in the show notes. If you enjoy this podcast, please click the subscribe button and share it with your friends. It will mean a lot to me. On this episode, we will be traveling to Brighton in England, San Pancho, Guadalajara, and Tequila in Mexico. Thanks to COVID-19, it was 2 years since we last went on holiday. During that time, both my mother and my elder brother died, and restrictions meant I was unable to visit them or go to their funerals. It had been a difficult time, so we were more than ready for a holiday. With great excitement, I packed my bag to meet Federika, who was already in England, staying with her daughter and grandchildren. One effect of COVID has been to make air travel much more expensive and less convenient. British Airways no longer flew to Croatia in the winter, so I had to fly with Vueling and change in Barcelona. As always, I arrived at the airport very early, and as it was set in stone, I had a baguette and a beer at the airport. Being 8:20 a.m., it was the earliest beer of my life, and I was sure I saw a hint of pity on the waiter's face. At Barcelona airport, I was directed into the international area where I had to wait 3 hours for my connecting flight, with the only choice of food being a baguette or something from Burger King. Meanwhile, there was a superb view of the domestic terminal below, which was full of interesting shops and restaurants. I suspect it was a conspiracy to encourage people to only take flights within Spain. I arranged for a taxi to pick me up at Gatwick Airport and drive me to the Grand Hotel Brighton, where I met Federika. It sounds a bit decadent, but I was surprised at what good value it was when I booked it in September. At £120 a night, with breakfast included, it was cheaper than most of the Airbnb apartments and without all the annoying extras they charge. Pulling up at the Grand with all its Christmas lights on was magical. We were shown to our room, and although I certainly wouldn't call it luxurious, it was very comfortable, and I had paid a little extra for a giant bed. The day before leaving Croatia, it was 18 degrees, so I was wearing shorts and had the windows open, which even for Dubrovnik was unusual for that time of year. I was concerned about being cold in the hotel, bearing in mind the temperature had just risen to around 0 degrees. The strange thing was that even though the central heating radiators were turned off, it was still so warm we had to turn on the air conditioning, as we were not able to open the window. The enormous breakfast room wasn't too busy, but there was a man in the corner who was on a phone call with the speakerphone at full blast, filling the whole dining room. The breakfast deserved its excellent reviews, and I loaded my plate with a full English. I moved to the toast conveyor belt and fed it with my mandatory 2 slices of bread. When I leaned forward to take the toast, I wasn't aware that I was holding my plate at an angle, so when I looked down, I saw a pile of baked beans and half an egg next to my foot. I told the waitress, who was very obliging, and cleared it quickly, but Mr. Grumpy came along a minute later and ordered her not to allow people with hot food to loiter around the toasting area. First morning of my holiday, and I was already on the naughty step. I went to a physio appointment at Hove County Cricket Ground, and as I looked out from the waiting room at the desolate cricket pitch, I thought of the countless hours when my dear old dad sat there during the happiest period of his life. I was reminded of a time when a batsman hit a 6 and the ball landed cleanly on his ankle, so he was taken to the same physio to be treated. It must have been very painful, but as it was his team that had hit the 6, he accepted the pain as a price well worth paying. My hip had been hurting me for the previous 2 years, and as the 3 physiotherapists I had tried weren't able to help, I thought I would try out this one that had come highly recommended. She was the first to give me a thorough examination and diagnose a problem with my pelvis, although I would need an MRI scan when I got back to Croatia to confirm it. It was good news, as at least I was a step closer to finding out what the problem was. My first thought was that I might need a hip replacement, but after a lengthy consultation with Dr. Google, I thought it might be something called bursitis. That would be great as it wouldn't require a new hip, and I was rather attached to the old one. It wasn't troubling me too much, and the biggest problem was that it would often give way underneath me, so it looked like I was going to fall, which gave people around me a bit of a scare. We gave our grandchildren the choice of any restaurant in Brighton for lunch, and of course they chose McDonald's. They each chose a Happy Meal as it came with a toy, which went straight into the rubbish bin as soon as the meal was over, which took around 3 minutes. I accidentally chose a cheeseburger meal deal and spent the next 5 minutes playing Find the Meat. In the shopping mall, there were various Christmassy things for kids to do, so it turned out to be a very pleasant morning, although I was happy to return to the hotel for my afternoon nap while Federika took them home. Every morning in Croatia, I kept up with the UK news, and with the cost of living crisis always in the headlines, I had the impression that with the dramatic rise in energy costs, most families were huddled around a lighted candle trying to keep warm. I certainly expected that there would be no Christmas lights outside people's houses because of the cost of running them. Even those who could afford outside lights, I thought, wouldn't switch them on for fear of flaunting their wealth at those who weren't even able to heat their homes. So I was quite surprised to see that everything appeared to be normal and there were lots of Christmas lights everywhere. The irony was that the government had given all householders, even the richest, £400 to go towards energy bills, so in a roundabout way taxpayers were paying some homeowners to run their Christmas lights. In Churchill Square there was a small stand selling luxury muffins. We bought 4 tiny ones, literally one mouthful, which came to £10. I walked past the stall 10 minutes later, and there was a long queue. The shopping centre was as busy as I had ever seen it, and the £80 I paid for a Lego set was dwarfed by people on the other tills who were paying £300 or more for a set. One interesting development in the UK was that for the previous 45 years, it was necessary to ask shops and restaurants if they accepted credit cards. Now, all of a sudden, I had to ask if they accepted cash. I didn't know if it was due to COVID and the spreading of germs or the inevitability that cash would eventually be phased out, but it felt strange. At one cashless restaurant, there was a barcode on our table, so I was able to scan it to see our bill and then pay online. I rarely paid cash unless I had to, and had recently become addicted to paying contactless with my phone, so it made no difference to me, although I expect there were plenty of people who mourned the passing of real money. After a pleasant 3 days in Brighton, we got Dave, our regular taxi driver, to take us to Heathrow Airport. Normally, I paid drivers extra to keep quiet during a journey, but having accepted that Dave simply had no control over his mouth, I found him quite entertaining. The only thing he wanted to do in life was to work, and his only ambition was to win the lottery, spending £40 a week towards that objective. I asked him what was the point of winning the lottery, if the only thing he wanted to do was work, and he revealed his master plan.
I'll give 5 million to each of my kids so they can all off.
As for the rest of the money, instead of people paying to use his cab, he would pay them. When he discovered I was a musician, he kept going on about his favourite guitarist, Roy. He was unable to elaborate on the name and rejected my suggestion that his surname might be Rogers, so the subject hit a dead end.
Happy trails to you.
As we wanted to go to Mexico this year, it was a good opportunity to stay with our son and his family in Seattle at Christmas. Check-in went smoothly, and, as always, the time went quickly before boarding the plane. It had been a while since we flew with British Airways, and whilst it was a new plane, the food had got worse. I didn't normally mind aeroplane food, but on that flight it was practically inedible. Wine made dinner slightly more palatable, but when Federica woke me from a deep sleep to have breakfast, I wished she hadn't. Normally I can eat any old crap, but this was some kind of hot sandwich, which I had to spit out and make do with a glass of orange. Our son met us at the airport, and as soon as we got to the car park, there was a blast of cold air, which came as a shock, as it had been a long time since I was in such temperatures. We had arrived in Seattle at around 7 p.m., so by the time we had something to eat and a chat, it was time to go to bed. I suppose it was due to the flight times, but neither of us suffered from jet lag. We expected it to catch up with us during the day, but both of us escaped it. Over the next few days, we went on the usual shopping trips and had a great dinner at the amazing crab factory, although there was a noticeable reduction in portion size since our last visit 6 years ago. Many of the houses in the area had elaborate lights which spread out onto the trees and shrubs, giving a warm Christmassy feel. One day, we went to the enormous Goodwill shop, which was their version of a charity shop. Federica loved to potter around these places, but after 10 minutes, I got bored. We agreed to meet in a coffee shop across the road, and after getting my coffee, I sat at a row of high tables. There was a high table on either side of me with 2 women sitting on each of them who were quite loud, so I could hear every word they said. That didn't bother me, but although I could put up with the cafe being cold, the chairs being uncomfortable, and even the continual upspeak from my neighbours, turning every sentence into a question, I couldn't handle the never-ending use of the word like.
Yesterday, I went to a restaurant with Jenny, and I really liked the pasta.
Yeah, I saw Jenny last week, and when she saw me, she was like, "What is the pasta like?"
It was unbearable, so I left the cafe screaming with my hands over my ears. I read somewhere that in one episode of Love Island, the word like was used 76 times in a 5-minute conversation, and it got so bad that many people stopped watching it. The almost compulsory giving of a huge tip in America always amused me. I asked our daughter-in-law how much she usually gave as a tip.
If the service is good, I give 20%, but if it is bad, I only give 15%.
The idea of giving a tip for bad service seems weird to me, but when in Rome and all that. When paying the bill by phone, I would be presented with a card reader, but no tip was not on the list. I liked that because it saved me from having to do any sums in my head, but I was even shown the tip option in self-service outlets. Fearing that a bolt of lightning might shoot from the card reader, I always tipped 10%. In some self-service places, the fries were salted by robotic arms, so was I really supposed to tip the robots? Our granddaughter got us hooked on some songs while we were there, and it became impossible for me to clean my teeth without singing the Brushy Brush song. Then came the brilliant Shake Your Sillies song just before bedtime. The whole family joined in, shaking small scarves, jumping and yawning, and doing all the other things required for a good night's sleep.
My journey is long, there's no time for song. I'll sleep for only seconds at a time. When you lay down each night, do you think of me in flight, soaring on the wings of your rhyme?
After spending a week with our son and his family in Seattle, we took a 5-hour flight to Puerto Vallarta in Mexico. I had arranged for the hotel to send a taxi to pick us up, but the day before they told me that only official airport taxis were allowed into the airport, so I had to leave the airport, walk across the bridge that spanned the motorway, and our driver would be waiting for us on the other side. I had always had an overactive imagination, which was invaluable for creativity, but often got in the way of everyday life. I was convinced that the bridge would be deserted, and halfway across we would be kidnapped by a band of desperate bandidos. I looked at posts from other travellers, and they confirmed the extortionate price of airport taxis, but said, if you are feeling adventurous, you could walk across the bridge to meet someone. When I read the word adventurous, I thought of my brother and his wife Laura, canoeing down the Zambezi with man-eating hippopotamuses on every corner. Seeing the word adventurous on TripAdvisor stretched my imagination even further, but I couldn't bring myself to pay $135 for an airport taxi compared to $35 for one from the hotel. As a precaution, I told our son I would send him a message as soon as we arrived at the hotel. I didn't want to alarm him with my concern, so I hoped that if he didn't hear from me, he would contact the police to discuss the ransom demand. I also wore my quick-release sandals so I could unleash my bare feet, and while they were no longer lethal weapons as they once were, they were still able to inflict a pretty serious case of athlete's foot. I needn't have worried. The whole area was packed with people, so it turned out to be as risky as climbing a stepladder without a parachute. Puerto Vallarta Airport was the most chaotic I had ever seen. Going through passport control was surprisingly quick, but once in the baggage collection area, it was a solid mass of people. No one knew where the end of the queue was or even what it was for. At first, I thought it was a queue for the conveyor belt until someone put me right. I pushed my way through to the baggage reclaim and realized that the queue was to take luggage through customs. I was dreading having to join my fellow escapees in the queue, but ironically, we waited so long for our luggage that by the time we were ready to leave, the queue was half gone, and it was easy to find the end. When we finally got out of the airport into the arrivals area, there was even more chaos. Once again, there was a solid mass of people, only this time they were waiting for taxis. Never had I been so happy to have booked a hotel transfer. It was only a short walk to the bridge, which was entirely free of bandidos, and with plenty of people around, I felt completely safe. Our driver, El Dube, far from being a bandido, was a very pleasant and interesting young man who, despite never having been outside Mexico, spoke perfect English. We planned to stay in smaller towns as we wanted to avoid the big holiday complexes with their all-inclusive deals. We stayed at the Marie Hotel Boutique in a small town called San Pancho, also known as San Francisco, which was an hour's drive from the airport. After unpacking, we went to a beach restaurant where I could indulge in one of my favorite dining experiences, eating while my feet were buried in the sand. We had been told that in Mexico, fish tacos were the thing to have, so that's what I ordered. It sounded so exotic, but in reality, it was just bits of fish in small tortillas with some dry lettuce. From what I could gather, the attraction came from putting hot sauces on them, which I didn't like, and without them the meal was bland. However, we had guacamole to start with, and instead of the usual tiny bowl, which was barely enough for one person, this was such a big portion that we struggled to finish it between the two of us. It was around 10 p.m. when we got back to the hotel, and though we were both shattered, it was too early to go to bed. Then, to our horror, we remembered there was a 2-hour time difference, so for us, the time was only 8 p.m. We tried to hold out, but it wasn't long before we surrendered to sleep. We both had a bad night, partly because of the time difference and the thudding of a distant bass drum, but mainly because of the noises outside, in particular, what sounded like enormous trucks with no silencers. Throughout most of the night, roosters did their cock-a-doodling sporadically, but around 5 a.m. they all got together for a jam session. We had chosen our hotel because it was a little out of town, where it was supposed to be quiet. I hadn't yet discovered that there was no escape from noise in Mexico. On the beach the next day, we had our first taste of how expensive Mexico was. We had assumed it would be very cheap, but 2 sunbeds and an umbrella for the day were £20, around double the price of Croatia. There was no bargaining, as they all seemed to charge the same price. Our usual practice on holiday was to find sunbeds and an umbrella and sit there until sunset. The problem in San Pancho was that the sea was too rough to swim in. We were used to rough seas in Peru, but there we could swim when we got past the breaking waves. In San Pancho, it was very difficult, so we hired the sunbeds for an hour and went to lunch. We spent a very pleasant afternoon watching surfers riding the huge waves, reminding me of the extraordinary things I was capable of when I was young. Surfers were getting wiped out regularly, which often involved multiple somersaults, while I struggled to get out of my chair amidst a chorus of grunting and groaning. Federika did try to swim, but was soon knocked over by a small wave. Next day we went on a day trip to nearby Sayulita, a much bigger resort than San Pancho. There was a lot of traffic and noise, and we read that at night it turns into one giant party, but it made for a good day trip. The waves were still very big, but much more manageable, so we had no trouble swimming. We also walked 500 meters to the Playa de los Muertos, which is translated the beach of the dead. It might not have been the most enticing holiday destination name, but it did have the advantage of being right next to a graveyard, so anyone getting into trouble on the beach didn't have far to go to their final resting place. We had lunch at an upmarket restaurant facing the sea. Federika ordered a Caesar salad, which the waiter prepared in front of us. He started by squashing anchovies into a large wooden bowl, and heaven knows what he did after that, but it took 15 minutes and I never realized a salad could taste so good. It seemed to be difficult to find whole fish anywhere, so I ended up ordering prawn tacos, which again were a little bland. That night, we found a lovely little rustic restaurant tucked away in a courtyard. There was an interesting trio playing live, consisting of an elderly hippie wearing a long skirt who sang and played Spanish guitar, a flute player and a drummer. It was an unusual combination, and the volume was just right. Halfway through the set, the hippie announced it was an open mic night, so the audience was welcome to get up and sing, dance, recite poetry or whatever. I usually avoided those things like the plague, but recently decided I ought to make an effort and join in. If I were getting paid, I would have chosen well-known, up-tempo songs to get people animated, but as it was for my own benefit, I chose songs that I liked to play, including one of my own. The guitar sound wasn't great, and it was always hard to get up and start playing, having not picked up a guitar for a while, but I played 3 songs well enough, and 3 tables were actually listening, which was a bonus. Despite it being 55 years since the first of my many thousands of performances, I still found myself fantasizing that there was a record company executive in the audience who would discover me. There was a man in front of us with his only company being a glass of tequila. He was a definite candidate for the route to stardom, but would you believe it, yet another night passed with me being famous only for my anonymity. What was the matter with those unimaginative record company executives? Why couldn't they see that there was a massive hole in the market for an almost bald, 72-year-old, unknown singer-songwriter with a dodgy hip?
I'm going down gently.
One thing that was beginning to irritate me was the number of restaurants that were playing techno dance music, often very loudly. A lot of people on the beach brought USB speakers, so anyone within a 30-meter radius was forced to listen to their music. On our last day, we paid for sunbeds for 2 hours, but after 15 minutes, a Mexican family sat next to us with dance music blaring in our ears, so we had to leave. We were both looking forward to eating lots of fish on holiday, so it was disappointing to find that the only fish on most menus were in tacos or empanadas. Finally, we found a restaurant that served whole red snapper, which we selected from a tray. We assumed it would be grilled, but they served it deep-fried. It was still very tasty and we enjoyed it, but it gave me indigestion and my stomach wasn't quite right for a couple of days afterwards. I had a stomach like an ox, so I was rarely affected in that way. By the end of our stay in San Pancho, I was beginning to realize that food might be an issue during our stay in Mexico. I wasn't keen on tortillas or refried beans and couldn't handle hot sauces and chilies, so that excluded me from most of what was on offer. During our holidays, we always liked to take an after-dinner stroll and potter around the shops. Everything was so expensive, and whilst we could afford to buy whatever we wanted, there wasn't much point when it was half the price in Croatia or even Seattle. On the plus side, there was none of that constant pestering by stallholders, which could be so tiresome.
The world is full of traps and stairs and well-worn paths that go nowhere. The truth is simple and doesn't care if he calls and you're not there.
We checked out of our hotel, and the receptionist told us to wait in reception until they had inspected our room. They wanted to make sure we hadn't stolen or wrecked anything. In all our years of travel, that had never happened to us before, but we had a good laugh about it. It was only a 1-hour flight to Guadalajara, where we were picked up by Lester, the taxi driver arranged by our hotel. Having lived a few years in Canada, his English was very good, and as he also offered a tour service, we booked him for a day trip to Tequila. Judging by the media, you would have thought that the entire population of Mexico was trying to get into the USA, so it was surprising to see Mexicans going happily about their business. Lester had returned to Mexico because he simply preferred it there. Guadalajara was made up of many different towns that had been integrated into one big city. Federika had read that Tlaquepaque, the area where we were staying, was regarded as being a cultural area rather than downtown, which was more about business. We were staying in a beautiful boutique hotel called La Villa de Ensueño, which was once a hospital. It must have been a weird hospital, as it consisted of many separate buildings, and most of the guest rooms were detached. It was decorated with traditional Mexican ceramics and was beautifully done. It was perfect, except for the night Federica had a visit from patients past who never made it out of the hospital, but she soon got back to sleep. We went into the center of Tlaquepaque, which was buzzing, and found the restaurant we were recommended, called Casa Luna. It was an old Mexican villa with a courtyard in the middle where the tables were. It was beautiful, but there were 10 couples ahead of us waiting for a table, so we went across the road to a place that looked equally nice. The inside was full, but there were tables outside, so they sat us next to a fountain, which was very pleasant. Federica had heard about the sauce, mole, which included chocolate amongst its long list of ingredients, so I ordered a steak mole. Federica's main course never turned up, so we ended up sharing mine, which was still more than enough. After finishing our main course, the waiter brought out our starter, a duck spring roll, which we also shared. Although the service was a little eccentric, the food was excellent, and the portions were so big that despite sharing, we struggled to finish. It was lovely to see so many families around and far fewer tourists than in San Pancho. With the altitude in Guadalajara being nearly 1,600 meters, we were expecting it to be cold, so we had brought lots of warm clothes, but it wasn't much colder than San Pancho. Next morning we were glad that we had brought warm clothes, as there was a surprising drop in temperature, and the breakfast area was large and not closed in. After breakfast, we took an Uber to the centre of town for a general look around. At Cathedral Square, we saw a group of youngsters doing a dance routine, which was fun to watch. There must have been some kind of impending dance competition, as there were little groups of dancers practicing all over the place. One of the main events of the square was the hourly bell ringing. Lunch was in a little restaurant overlooking the square, and while the lunch was terrible, the view was lovely. In the afternoon, we took a ride around town in an old carriage. Ours was electric, and as we pulled away, we saw there were horse-drawn carriages, so I was annoyed with myself for not taking a better look at what was on offer. It was just as well, though, because as we drove alongside the horses, there was a terrible smell of horse shit that was collected inside a little bag between the horse's arse and the carriage. If we had chosen one of those, I assumed we would have had to endure the smell during the ride. It turned out to be a trip of a lifetime. By that, I mean having done it once, I would never want to do it again. The carriage wheels were solid, and the streets were mainly cobblestones, so it was extremely uncomfortable. We had a running commentary during the trip, but it was mainly,
"On the left, there is a library. On the right, there is a theater. In front of us, there is a road."
so nothing too enthralling. But as always, we enjoyed it. That evening, we walked around Tlaquepaque again, trying to find somewhere to eat. Apart from fried peppers, we had not even seen a vegetable since we arrived in Mexico, so we both felt the need for some, especially as my stomach was still delicate after the fried fish a few days before. We found a stand that was selling nothing but cooked vegetables, so we bought some and sat down on a bench to eat them. I can't say I enjoyed it, but it was definitely what I needed. My hip was gradually getting worse, and there were times when I wondered if I would get through the holiday. It would be okay all day, even after a lot of walking, and then for a few minutes I could hardly walk. It was beginning to look like I might need a hip replacement, which was weird, as I thought that mainly happened to old people. Next morning, we went on a day trip to Tequila. Federica always looked for tours wherever we went, and despite hating the taste of tequila, it sounded interesting. Our taxi driver, Lester, turned out to be a very good guide, and during the hour-and-a-half drive, he gave us a lot of information about what we would be seeing. All over the world, the only drink that was allowed to be called tequila had to come from Tequila. Other towns were making the same drink, but they weren't allowed to call it tequila. As we approached the town, we started seeing large fields of agave plants, which tequila is made. Our first stop was a distillery, where we were shown the process of how the agave was picked, cooked, cut, and eventually put into large barrels where they were distilled. Next, the tequila was put into different types of barrels for different lengths of time, depending on what product was required. At the end of the tour, a young girl gave us 4 different types of tequila, ranging from the basic product to one that was 10 years old, and the price varied accordingly. She also showed us the proper way of tasting it so it didn't burn our mouths. Federica found it enlightening, but for me, the best method was to take it straight from the glass and flush it down the nearest toilet. No burning and no hangover. To be fair, I would do the same with the finest brandy or whiskey, as I don't like them either. Next stop was a huge field of agave, where Lester described how it was cut and transported. Then he left us to spend a couple of hours in town. On arrival, we saw 3 men climbing up a very high pole. When they got to the top, they appeared to be doing nothing except winding rope around the pole. At that point, someone held a hat in front of us asking for money. I always give a few bob to street performers, but not when all they do is sit on a pole fiddling with a rope. 10 minutes later, we were just about to leave when each of them hooked one end of the rope around their ankles and hung from the ropes, which started the pole spinning slowly while the men descended upside down. It wasn't the most spectacular event I had ever seen, and the men who probably did it 30 times a day looked thoroughly bored with the whole thing. But it was entertaining. Lunch was again in the center courtyard of an old house, and while they still served your basic tacos, they were definitely better quality than anything we had been served so far. I always made videos of our travels, and so it is good to have a photo of anything that shows the town's name to use as a title. Mexico was very good for that, as every town had a sign with large, colourful lettering. In Tequila, a group of young kids had monopolized the sign and were charging tourists for taking photos. Good luck to them for being so enterprising, but they were getting a bit carried away, so it took 10 minutes to photograph each tourist from all the different angles, including a few where the kid lay on his back and took a photo from the bottom up. We didn't want to go through all that fuss and would have been happy to give them money to just leave us alone, but they had a mafia-like grip on the sign. We waited for a lull in the photo shoot and sneaked one in while they were negotiating with some tourists. Our last stop was an amazing hotel called the Cofradia, where all the rooms were giant barrels. There was also an enormous underground restaurant, so I assumed they catered for big events, which would give the hotel a great novelty value for large groups. It was fun, but I wouldn't pay so much extra for a room just for the novelty of sleeping in a barrel. The journey home took over 2 hours because of all the traffic, but Federika had a nice chat with the driver while I drifted in and out of sleep. At night we went to the local town again and were surprised to see that at our first choice restaurant, La Luna, there was no queue to get in. Someone showed us to a lovely little table in the large courtyard, but as soon as I sat down, I knew I couldn't possibly eat there. Despite being a sophisticated, high-class Mexican restaurant with an average clientele age of at least 60 years old, they were playing loud techno dance music. I had to shout to Federika to be heard, and the oppressive boom, boom, boom of the bass drum made it sound like we were on a building site. It was a lovely restaurant and I really wanted to stay, but I just couldn't bear it, so we went across the street to where we had an excellent meal on our first day. It was half empty, and a young girl showed us to a table, but they were also playing loud dance music. Not quite as bad as the other place, but still enough to ruin a nice dinner. I really didn't understand the logic of it. Never in the history of the world has anyone sat at a restaurant table and said,
"I'm sorry, but we can't eat here because you are not playing loud techno music."
On the other hand, there are plenty of people like us who will either leave or never return because of it. Why not play background music that doesn't upset anyone? On our last day, we booked a walking tour of the city, meeting in front of the cathedral. Our guide was a young Mexican who was great, but I had never known anyone with such a piercing voice. I had to stand a couple of meters away from him to stop it hurting my ears. I thought it was just me, so I was surprised to hear that Federika had the same problem. He was very knowledgeable, but went into too much detail, so it got a bit tedious at times, although we couldn't help but like him. The highlight of the tour was a visit to the government palace, where there were murals by the world-famous artist Orozco. I wasn't crazy about the murals, but Federika really enjoyed them and told me the main attraction was the symbolism. I had always been wary of anything that required arbitrary interpretation to be appreciated. In the past, people paid for an audio tour that included headphones, which I always liked and sometimes preferred to a real-life guide. I was starting to notice people who had downloaded audio guides onto their phones and were using them without headphones, so in what should be a quiet environment, I could now hear 2 or 3 electronic guides playing at the same time. The tour finished with us going to an enormous food hall offering a wide variety of all things tortilla, but I managed to find some kind of goat stew, which was pretty good. The guide sat with us and gave us his life story, which ended in the present with him studying for his master's degree in sociology. Late afternoon, I had an email from the taxi company, which was going to pick us up at Cancun Airport the next day and take us to Puerto Morelos. I was not one to panic, but the email said they had to cancel our transfer because taxis were striking in protest at the government's decision to allow Uber in the area. There was talk of roads being blockaded, which would make it impossible for taxis and buses to get to the airport. I remembered how chaotic it was in Puerto Vallarta when we arrived with hundreds of people queuing for taxis that were working normally. What on earth was it going to be like in Cancun Airport with no taxis? We were frantically trying to think of alternatives, but sometimes trying to avoid a bad situation can make matters worse. Thank you for listening to Nemo James Travel Diaries. Photos and videos of my adventures, together with my music and the books I have published, can be found on my website www.nemojames.com/travels. You will also find details of my mobile phone app, Wordbanker, which is designed to help you build a foreign language vocabulary. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please click the subscribe button and share it with your friends. It will mean a lot to me. In the next episode, we will be traveling to Mexico, Puerto Morelos, and Valladolid.
Do you like the songs I've sung to you? Do you like the time that we've been through? Do you like my music? Do you like to sing along? Yes, we like the songs that you have sung. We like the friends that we've become. We like your music. We like your music. We like your music and the words of your song.